very often in a relationship, there's a very natural breakdown between who is the more dominant character, I'm pointing this way, and who's the more submissive character, I'm pointing this way. And it's actually quite natural for people to sort of tend towards people that actually fit their opposite quite naturally. When two very dominant people get together, they don't normally make it to marriage because there's been too much
one of them is
conflict on the
dead.
way. Exactly. So when you have a natural dominant aggressive or dominant submissive balance, what can happen in the name of peace is that the submissive person can allow the dominant person to just dominate, because then there's never any conflict. What then happens is that the dominant person gets into the habit of not listening to the submissive person, and the submissive person gets into the habit of never really speaking their mind, and that really can create peace, but also it can be an unhappy peace, because instead of resolving any conflicts that would have been had you both spoken up, there's just been a sort of a natural tendency for one person to say nothing and one person to say everything. So I think it's really important for us to see this word conflict not as a negative thing, meaning confrontation can be negative and conflict can be negative. But when two people are in a conversation and they respect each other, the dominant person might need to learn to take a step back to make space for the submissive person, but the submissive person needs to learn to speak up about how they feel for there to be balance in the relationship. In the course of that conversation, there might be some real listening that needs to happen and some real talking that needs to happen. But if that process of the dominant person holding back and the submissive person speaking up doesn't happen, you end up with a very, very uneven relationship where one person's silently very unhappy and the other person's completely oblivious to it. And that's not
And
actually
also, by the way,
peace.
the dominant person might feel like they're getting the run of the house and they get to do things their way and it's the right way. But they're actually not growing. They're really not growing. They're not gaining from the perspective and the wisdom of the other person. And that's a terrible shame for them, because we all need input. That's really a big part of a relationship, is two is better than one. So if you're in a situation where two's not better than one, I need to make all the decisions and then have my logistics done over here, that's a terrible situation to be in. Terrible.
So I think the point over here is that conflict is not a bad thing, because if it's done respectfully, if one person is learning to listen more and the other person is learning to speak more, the fact that they disagree doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the relationship. On the contrary, when I hear the opposing opinion, when I hear the dissent, I'm much more able to say, oh, that's interesting, I can actually take that into consideration and grow from that.
Right.
Otherwise, you end up with what looks like a peaceful relationship, but it's actually just a broken down relationship. So don't be scared of conflict. And if you're the submissive person, you have to have the courage to speak up. And if you're the dominant person, you might have to learn the skill of listening. But that will actually enrich your relationship and what you actually can bring to the other, and avoid all the resentment, frustration, and boredom that ends up happening if there's no conversation at all.
Yeah, and just on the other way, by the way, it's not just the submissive person has to have the courage to speak up, but the domineering person has to have the courage to let the submissive person speak up. They have to have the humility and the courage to make space for the other person. And the submissive person needs to understand that the dominant person is not always dominating because they're strong. Often they're dominating because they're frightened or because they're threatened. There's all kinds of things going on. So it takes wisdom and understanding of your partner to be able to make space for them in the way that they might need. And it's not always as simple as just confront the dominant one. It can be making space in different ways. And that's something I think that each relationship's kind of unique on. And it takes trust and love.
While we're on the topic of dominant and submissive people, this is also super important to bear in mind. A person who is loud and straight speaking and what some people might even call aggressive. Being aggressive doesn't mean a person's not sensitive, meaning they may have a very forceful way of talking, but it doesn't mean you can say whatever you want to them without hurting them. The fact that I'm very straight talking and say out front and get all my feelings out doesn't mean that I have no feelings and that you can sort of attack me or bully. That's really important to bear in mind. And the other side of this is that sometimes a person is very sweet and very non-confrontational and doesn't say things straight. And the aggressive person might think, just say what you feel. Just say what you feel doesn't help with someone who has a very hard time saying what they feel. So bear in mind in the dynamic of that relationship that if you have an aggressive partner, don't think that means that they're not sensitive. And if you have a person who has a very hard time saying it straight, don't think that it's just easy for them to turn on the ability to say it straight. You've got to make allowances for who people really are and how people function. Otherwise you end up in horrible conflict, expecting things of the other they just cannot deliver on.